Hello everyone and welcome to my Y&R Trends channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The stillness of the mansion was a lie. A fragile veneer of polished wood and tasteful artwork stretched taut over a churning cauldron of secrets. In the grand hallway, the only sounds were the solemn tick of an antique clock and the frantic, thudding rhythm of Kyle Abbott's own heart, a drumbeat of panic echoing in the cavern of his own skull. He was frozen, one hand still resting against the cool, ornate doorframe of the study, his body half-turned in a desperate, abortive flight. He had been caught. The word itself was a splash of ice water down his spine. It wasn't just being discovered in a private space. It was the specific, sordid nature of his transgression. He had been peeping, spying, reducing himself to the level of a common voyeur, all in his desperate, clawing quest for answers, for leverage, for anything that might steady the ground that had been crumbling beneath his feet for months. The object of his scrutiny, the person he had been straining to overhear, was now standing mere feet away, and her presence was a physical pressure in the room, a shift in the atmospheric pressure that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. He had followed a hunch, a gut-wrenching suspicion that had festered since the moment Claire Grace had entered their lives, wielding a story of redemption and long-lost connection that had so thoroughly captivated his aunt, Diane, and, most distressingly, his own father, Jack. There was something about her eyes, a flicker of something behind the placid, grateful demeanor that didn't align with the tragic narrative she sold. It was in the way she sometimes looked at the Abbott family portraits, not with wistful longing, but with a calculating stillness that set Kyle's teeth on edge. So when he'd seen her slip into the study with Harrison, his son, his most precious and vulnerable responsibility, a cold dread had wrapped around his heart. He hadn't planned to eavesdrop. It was a primal impulse, a father's terrified need to protect his child from a potential wolf in sheep's clothing. He'd lingered in the shadowed hallway, his ear nearly pressed to the heavy oak door, listening to the murmur of her voice speaking to his little boy. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone seemed gentle, which only unnerved him more. The dissonance was maddening. Then he'd heard her footsteps approach the door, and he'd scrambled back, but not quickly enough. The door had swung open, and there she stood, her expression unreadable for a moment before it settled into a look of mild inquiry that he knew, with every fiber of his being, was a masterful performance. Now facing her, Kyle's mind was a riot of conflicting impulses. Part of him, the part groomed for corporate boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, screamed at him to compose himself, to fabricate a plausible reason for his loitering presence. He was looking for a book. He thought he'd heard Harrison. He'd gotten turned around. But that part was being violently shouted down by the raw, primal terror of a father who felt his child was in danger, and the profound shame of a man who had been caught in such a cheap, undignified act. His palms were slick with sweat, and he could feel a single traitorous bead of it tracing a path from his temple down his cheek. He tried to speak, to offer some flimsy excuse, but his throat had constricted, producing only a dry, rasping sound. His gaze darted past her into the study, searching for Harrison, needing the visual confirmation that his son was safe, unharmed, untainted by whatever darkness he was now convinced Claire carried with her. The boy was sitting on the rug, contentedly playing with a set of building blocks, oblivious to the silent, seismic confrontation happening just feet away. This normalcy, this picture of innocence, somehow made the situation feel even more grotesque. Claire did not speak immediately. She simply observed him, her head tilted slightly, and in that prolonged silence, Kyle felt himself being dissected. Her eyes, usually softened by a carefully cultivated warmth, were now sharp, analytical instruments. They scanned his face, taking in the sheen of perspiration, the widened pupils, the subtle tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by clenching them into fists at his sides. She was, he realized with a fresh wave of nausea, enjoying this. She was savoring his panic, relishing the power she held in this moment where he was exposed, and she was utterly, terrifyingly composed. The mask of the grateful, slightly fragile newcomer was still technically in place, but it had developed hairline fractures through which this new, colder, more formidable woman peered out. She took a small, deliberate step forward, not enough to be overtly threatening, but enough to reassert her control over the space, to remind him that he was the intruder here, the one who had violated the unspoken rules of hospitality and privacy. The air between them crackled with unspoken accusations. Finally, just as Kyle managed to draw a ragged breath to attempt speech again, Claire's lips parted. Her voice, when it came, was not the gentle melodic tone she used with Harrison or the respectfully quiet one she employed with Diane. It was low, measured, and carried a chilling, almost conversational calmness, as if they were discussing the weather and not the fact that he had just been caught spying on her interaction with his son. "Kyle," she began, and the way she said his name was a violation in itself. It wasn't a question, nor was it filled with the anger he expected. It was a statement, a declaration that she saw him, all of him, in this moment of profound weakness, and she was not impressed. She took another half-step, closing the distance just enough that her next words would be for him alone, a secret shared in the echoing silence of the Abbott mansion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." This was her first statement, and it landed not as a cliché, but as a precise surgical strike. It was a mockery of his fear, a way of pointing out that his reaction was disproportionate, hysterical even. He wasn't facing a physical threat. He was facing her, and his terror was therefore a testament to the power he had unconsciously granted her. It was a way of seizing the narrative, of framing him as the unstable element, the one gripped by paranoia, while she remained the picture of serene rationality. The words hung in the air, and Kyle felt their poison seep into him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He had, in a way. He was seeing the ghost of every threat that had ever loomed over his family, every manipulator who had ever sought to use the Abbott name and fortune for their own ends. He was seeing the ghost of his own past mistakes, his own vulnerabilities, reflected back at him in her calm, assessing gaze. He wanted to shout, to denounce her, to demand to know what she was really doing here, what her true intentions were with his family, with his son. But the sentence died in his throat, strangled by the sheer, unnerving power of her composure. She had not denied anything, had not expressed outrage. She had simply observed his state and commented on it, and in doing so had taken complete control of the encounter. He was no longer the accuser. He was the specimen under glass. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Claire's mouth, a flicker of expression that was there and gone so quickly Kyle wondered if he had imagined it. But its ghost remained, a chilling imprint on the moment. Her eyes held his, refusing to let him look away, forcing him to endure the humiliation of his own panic. She was drawing out the silence again, letting the weight of her first statement settle, allowing his own imagination to fill the void with its worst fears. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, a frantic counter-rhythm to the clock's steady, indifferent tick. He thought of his father, Jack, and his unwavering belief in Claire's redemption story. He thought of Diane, who had welcomed her with such open arms. How could they not see what he was seeing? How could they be so blind to the calculating intelligence behind the carefully constructed mask of the wounded soul? In this moment, faced with the real Claire, he felt a terrifying isolation, as if he were the only sane man in a world that had gone mad, the only one who could perceive the serpent they had invited into their garden. Then Claire spoke again, her voice dropping even lower, becoming almost intimate, a confidential whisper that was far more menacing than a shout could ever be. This was her second statement. "You should be more concerned about the secrets you're keeping than the ones you think you're uncovering." The air left Kyle's lungs in a soft, involuntary gasp. It was as if she had reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart. This was no longer a generic observation about his state of mind. This was a direct, targeted missile aimed at the very core of his own insecurities. What secrets was she referring to? His mind raced, a frantic inventory of every corner he had cut in business, every white lie told to protect Harrison, every moment of doubt and weakness he had hidden from his family, every complicated, unresolved feeling he still harbored about his past, about his relationships, about himself. She couldn't possibly know about any of that, could she? The doubt was a seed, instantly sprouting into a tangled, choking vine of paranoia. Was this a lucky guess? A manipulator's classic technique of speaking in vague generalities that the target would then specifically apply to their own guilty conscience? Or did she have actual knowledge? Had she been watching him, studying him, compiling her own dossier while he was busy trying to build one on her? The implication was clear and devastating. "I am not the vulnerable one here. You are." She was turning the tables completely. By referencing his own secrets, she was effectively saying that his investigation of her was nothing more than a projection, a desperate attempt to externalize his own internal guilt. It was a psychological masterstroke. His peeping, his spying, was now reframed not as a protective act, but as the frantic flailing of a man who was terrified of being exposed himself. The moral high ground he had believed he occupied crumbled into dust beneath his feet. He was no longer the righteous protector. He was a hypocrite, a man with a glass house who was foolishly throwing stones. The panic within him mutated, transforming from the fear of an external threat to the cold, gripping dread of self-incrimination. What if she went to Jack? What if she started whispering these insinuations to Diane? They would think he was losing his grip, that his judgment was clouded by his own unresolved issues. She was isolating him, cutting him off from his potential allies before he could even make his case against her. Kyle's thoughts spiraled, tumbling over one another in a chaotic jumble. He saw his credibility dissolving, his warnings being dismissed as the ravings of a paranoid man. He saw Claire, the picture of calm sincerity, being comforted by his family while he was sidelined, viewed with suspicion and pity. The very foundation of his position within the family, hard won after so many past struggles, felt suddenly fragile. All of this passed through his mind in the space of a few heartbeats, mirrored in the widening of his eyes and the slight, helpless parting of his lips. Claire watched it all, her expression never changing, her gaze locked on his as if she were reading the turmoil in his soul like an open book. She had not moved, but she had him completely cornered, not physically but psychologically. He was trapped in the prison of his own secrets and fears, and she was the warden who had just demonstrated her intimate knowledge of its layout. The silence stretched on, thicker and more suffocating than before. Kyle found he could not form a single word in response. Any denial would sound weak. Any counteraccusation would seem like a deflection. She had checkmated him with two simple sentences. He was utterly defeated, exposed not just as a voyeur, but as a flawed, vulnerable man whose own house was not in order. He could only stand there, waiting for the final blow, for the third thing she would say that would surely shatter what was left of his composure. He braced himself, his body tense, his every nerve ending screaming. He expected a threat, a specific accusation, a promise of exposure. But Claire's third statement, when it came, was perhaps the most devastating of all precisely because it was not a direct attack. She did not lean in. She did not raise her voice. She simply held his gaze, her own eyes now holding a glimmer of something that looked almost like pity, but a pity that was cold and condescending, the kind offered by a victor to a vanquished opponent. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried with the clarity of a shattering crystal. "The boy is safe with me," she said. "It's you he needs protection from." The words were like a physical blow, driving the last vestiges of air from Kyle's body. This was no longer about his secrets in general. This was a direct, brutal strike at his most sacred role, that of a father. She was weaponizing his love for his son. She was suggesting that his own instability, his paranoia, his secret-keeping, made him the true danger in Harrison's life. She was positioning herself not as a threat, but as a stable, safe presence, while simultaneously painting him as a toxic, damaging influence. The sheer, audacious cruelty of it left him reeling. It was a complete and utter inversion of reality as he knew it. The predator was claiming the mantle of protector, and she was doing so by pointing the finger at him. "It's you he needs protection from." The sentence echoed in his mind, a toxic mantra that he knew, with a sickening certainty, would haunt his every interaction with his son from this moment forward. Every time he felt anger, every time he made a mistake, every time he tried to shield Harrison from the world's harshness, this accusation would be there, whispering in the back of his mind. She had not just won this confrontation. She had planted a time bomb in his psyche, a seed of doubt about his own fitness as a parent that would be nearly impossible to uproot. Having delivered her 3 devastating statements, Claire did not wait for a response. She had said all she needed to say. She offered him one last, long, inscrutable look, a look that seemed to say, "We understand each other now." Then she turned away from him, her movement fluid and unconcerned, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture she had briefly noted. She walked back into the study, her focus shifting instantly and entirely to Harrison. Kyle, still frozen in the hallway, watched through the open door as she knelt down beside his son, her posture once again transforming into that of the gentle, attentive caregiver. She said something to Harrison, her voice now warm and melodic, and the little boy looked up at her and laughed, a sound of pure, untainted joy that cut through Kyle like a shard of glass. The contrast was unbearable. The monstrous woman who had just psychologically eviscerated him was gone, replaced in an instant by the kind, loving Aunt Claire that his family adored. It was a chilling demonstration of her skill, her ability to shift personas so completely and so convincingly. Kyle felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the world had tilted on its axis and he was the only one who had noticed. He was left standing alone in the vast, silent hallway, the echo of Harrison's laughter and the memory of Claire's cold, precise words warring within him. The panic had not subsided. It had simply mutated into a deep, chilling horror. It was no longer the simple fear of being caught. It was the terrifying realization that he was up against an adversary of unimaginable skill and ruthlessness, an adversary who had just proven that she could not only see through him but could also dismantle him using his own deepest fears and loves as her tools. He was alone, he was discredited in his own mind, and he was more afraid than he had ever been in his life. The battle lines had been drawn not in the open, but in the shadows of his own conscience, and he had already lost the first, and perhaps most critical engagement. In the dim glow of the Abbott Mansion's grand library, where shadows danced like forgotten secrets across leather-bound tomes and polished oak shelves, Kyle Abbott found himself frozen in a moment of utter recklessness. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, its rhythmic insistence a mocking reminder of the boundaries he was about to shatter. He had come home early from a tense board meeting at Jabot, his mind still reeling from the latest corporate skirmish with his father Jack. But instead of seeking solace in a stiff drink or the comfort of his own bed, Kyle's feet had carried him here, to the French doors leading to the garden terrace. It was Claire's doing, or so he told himself, that invisible pull she exerted on him like a siren's call amid Genoa City's endless drama. Claire Grace, with her porcelain skin and eyes that held the storm clouds of a fractured past, had been weaving her way into the fabric of his life since her arrival, a whirlwind of vulnerability and veiled menace that both terrified and enthralled him. Tonight, though, it wasn't her presence that drew him. It was the faint murmur of voices from the garden, low and urgent, laced with a tension that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. He shouldn't have looked. God, he knew better. But the sliver of moonlight slicing through the partially open doors was too tempting, and before he could summon the willpower to turn away, Kyle pressed his eye to the cool glass, peering out into the night like a thief in his own home. The garden was a sanctuary of manicured hedges and blooming night jasmine, their scents mingling with the crisp autumn air that whispered promises of winter's approach. Claire stood there, her silhouette ethereal against the stone fountain's gentle trickle, but she wasn't alone. A man loomed in the shadows just beyond the lantern's reach, a figure Kyle didn't immediately recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with a posture that screamed guarded intensity. Holden's face caught the light briefly as he turned, his jaw set like chiseled granite, eyes scanning the darkness as if expecting ghosts to rise from the flower beds. Who was he? Kyle's mind raced, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations from the Newman clan, rumors of Claire's shadowy connections, her time in that godforsaken psychiatric ward, and the uncle she'd mentioned in passing, the one with a name like a storm cloud. Holden. Yes, that was it. Not family in the blood sense, but tied to her by chains of loyalty and lies. A protector or perhaps a puppet master. Kyle couldn't decide. They were deep in conversation, Claire's hands gesturing wildly, her voice a hushed blade cutting through the quiet. Kyle strained to hear, his breath fogging the glass in shallow bursts, heart pounding a staccato rhythm that drowned out the fountain's song. This was madness. He was the COO of a cosmetics empire, not some voyeur skulking in the shadows. Yet here he was, peeping like a fool, driven by a cocktail of jealousy and curiosity that burned hotter than any boardroom betrayal. Claire's words drifted to him in snippets, fragmented like shattered crystal. Can't keep pretending, Holden. The masks are cracking, and if they find out... Her voice trailed off as she paced, her heels clicking softly against the flagstone path, each step a punctuation to her unraveling. Holden reached out, his large hand clamping gently but firmly on her shoulder, steadying her like an anchor in turbulent seas. They won't. he murmured, his tone low and gravelly, carrying the weight of unspoken threats. Not if you follow the plan. Victor's empire is blind to the edges. We slip through the cracks. Kyle's stomach twisted. Victor Newman? What did the old Mustang have to do with this? His mind flashed to recent whispers at the athletic club. Alliances shifting like sand dunes. Claire's sudden integration into the Newman fold under Victoria's watchful eye. And now this clandestine meeting. Was Claire playing both sides? Spying for some unseen force? Kyle's fingers tightened on the doorframe, knuckles whitening, as a wave of panic crested within him. He imagined the fallout. Jack's disappointment, Summer's knowing glare. The tabloids feasting on yet another Abbott scandal. But deeper still lurked the personal sting. Claire, the woman who'd cracked his armored heart with her quiet confessions over late-night coffees, revealing herself as something treacherous. He needed to move, to retreat before they spotted him, but his body betrayed him, rooted in place by the magnetic pull of their exchange. As if sensing the invisible eyes upon her, Claire froze mid-sentence, her head tilting slightly toward the mansion. Holden's hand dropped from her shoulder, his body shifting into a defensive stance, muscles coiling like a predator scenting danger. Kyle's breath hitched, a sharp intake that echoed too loudly in his own ears. Panic surged through him now, hot and electric, propelling his feet backward in a clumsy stumble. His elbow caught the edge of a side table, sending a crystal decanter teetering perilously before it righted itself with a soft clink that might as well have been a gunshot in the silence. Time stretched into agonizing infinity. Kyle held his breath, willing the shadows to swallow him whole. From the garden, Holden's voice cut through, sharper now. What was that? Claire's response was a whisper Kyle couldn't catch, but her silhouette moved toward the doors, graceful yet purposeful, like a moth drawn to a flame she knew would burn. Kyle bolted then, instincts overriding reason, his socks sliding silently across the Persian rug as he darted behind a towering bookshelf. Heart slamming against his ribs like a caged animal, he crouched low, peering through the gaps in the volumes, Dickens and Austen bearing unwitting witness to his folly. The doors creaked open and Claire stepped inside, the cool night air trailing her like a cloak. She paused, scanning the room with those piercing blue eyes, the ones that had once looked at him with unguarded hope. Now they held suspicion, a flicker of something darker that made Kyle's blood run cold. Minutes ticked by in torturous slowness, each one amplifying the chaos in Kyle's mind. He could hear Holden lingering just outside, a low murmur of reassurance to Claire before the garden door clicked shut again, sealing them back into secrecy. Claire lingered a moment longer, her fingers trailing the edge of a leather armchair, as if debating whether to summon the household or dismiss the noise as a trick of the wind. Kyle's thoughts spiraled. What if she called his name? What excuse could he possibly muster? Insomnia, a forgotten book. The truth would destroy whatever fragile trust they'd built. The late-night talks where she'd confessed her fears of being forever labeled the crazy Grace. And he'd shared his own scars from the Summer-Tucker triangle. No, he couldn't let it unravel like this. As her footsteps echoed toward the hallway, Kyle exhaled silently, his body sagging against the shelf. She was gone for now, but the panic clung to him like damp fog, seeping into his bones. He waited another eternity before emerging, his face flushed, hands trembling as he poured a generous splash of scotch from the decanter he'd nearly toppled. The amber liquid burned down his throat, a temporary balm, but it did nothing to quench the fire of questions raging inside. Who was Holden really? What plan threatened the delicate balance of Genoa City's power players? And Claire? Sweet, damaged Claire. How deep did her deceptions run? Kyle sank into the armchair she touched moments ago, the scent of her perfume lingering faintly, jasmine and regret. Sleep would elude him tonight. Instead, he'd plot his next move, a shadow in his own life, peeping at truths he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Dawn crept over Genoa City like a reluctant confession, painting the skyline in hues of rose and gold that belied the undercurrents of intrigue bubbling beneath. Kyle had barely closed his eyes, his mind a carousel of fragmented visions. Claire's tense posture, Holden's unyielding gaze, the phantom clink of crystal that had nearly betrayed him. By the time he descended the grand staircase, the mansion stirred with the familiar hum of morning, Mrs. Martinez in the kitchen clattering pans, the distant ring of the landline that Jack insisted on keeping despite the advent of smartphones. Kyle poured coffee black as his mood, the steam rising